Hello, my name is Dr. Erin Crockett, and I am a professor of psychology here at Southwestern University. I'm also an alum of the university and care passionately for Southwestern and Southwestern students. So let me just start by saying thank you so much for the time you are spending mentoring our students. I've seen firsthand over the years how pouring into their lives in this sort of a way really makes a difference for the sorts of outcomes our students have. So thank you. My goal in the next few minutes is just to talk a little bit about our student body, how that has changed over time, things that are similar, things that are different, and then tips on how to best engage that student body. So I'll start with how things have changed over time. One metric that we can compare our students on is looking at where they fell in their graduating class. And so what this graph does is it shows the number of students that we've admitted to Southwestern that have come here that were in the top 25% of their class. And if you look at these numbers over the last 20 years, what you see is it's very similar. We are still getting the large majority of students coming into Southwestern who graduated in the top quarter of their class. So we have really high achieving students that are coming to us at Southwestern. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge that standardized test scores may not always be the most accurate indicator of the quality of our students. We know that there's systematic bias in these scores, but if we can accept that they're less than perfect indicators, we see very similar things when we look at both SAT scores and ACT scores of students that have come in over the years. So here's SAT scores, and again, over the past 20 years, there's minor fluctuations up and down, very small in magnitude, but we don't see a change in those scores over the 20 years, or a clear trend that's here. And it's similar with ACT scores. As a statistician, I feel obligated to point out the axis that we're looking at here is a very small one. So it goes from a 24 to a 27.5. So it looks like you have these big up and down swings. Really, what you're looking at is no change over time, right? These scores are fluctuating within 1, maybe 2 points over the past 20 years. But over time, we've been very consistent in the ACT scores of the students we've admitted to Southwestern. So big picture, what are these graphs telling us? We are still bringing in some of the best and brightest students into our school each year. But there has been one thing that has changed, and that is what you're looking at this slide right here. If you look at the number of underrepresented populations that we have brought in at Southwestern, kind of as a marker of diversity of our students, you will notice a clear upwards trend. Over the last 20 years, Southwestern has become increasingly diverse as a student body. We are bringing in people from all sorts of different areas, from different underrepresented groups. We are really excited about this change. It is consistent with the core values of Southwestern, and it has been really fun to watch this change over the years. But these changes do have implications for you as you are mentoring our students. So here are some quick facts about our current SU students. First, you'll see that 18% of the students here on campus are first-generation college students. And that has implications when you're thinking about mentoring them through the process of finding things like internships for jobs. One of the things we know is for individuals whose parents may not have gone to college, they are usually less aware of the importance of taking advantage of what we call high impact practices, of which internships is one of those. So they probably are less familiar, one, with why those are so important, and two, how to best navigate those things. So there might be times when you're mentoring our students that it's helpful to over-explain some of that. Talk about how important it is to have internship experience. Talk about the benefits and be ready to walk them through step by step what that might look like. Another thing, and this is probably pretty similar for Southwestern over the past few years, but we do have a larger percent of female students. We also have a growing percentage of our students that are both Hispanic and from underrepresented groups. We know both women and other types of underrepresented groups are not only underrepresented on college campuses, but also in certain job sectors. So for example, the tech industry is a place where we see systematic discrimination in the hiring of underrepresented groups. Because of that, these students may be less likely to consider these sorts of fields that they are very qualified for. They may have less exposure to some of these fields. And so building self-efficacy about their ability to successfully navigate these career choices would be really important. Pointing out to them people that identify similarly with them that are in these fields also becomes really huge in making them feel like these are options that are available to them as well. You'll see that about 30% of our students are Pell eligible. What that means, Pell eligibility is a Pell grant is a federal grant that is available to students whose combined household income is somewhere around or less than $50,000. This means that some of these students have considerable need, both for them and their family members, as far as having income associated with some of these experiences. So for example, taking an unpaid internship could be a considerable hardship for these students. As they're thinking through the types of internships that might help set them up for a wonderful job, they also need to be able to find internships that will earn some sort of income for them, and in some cases for their families. About 3% of our students are non-traditional, so it's not a huge population, but still something that's worth being aware of. About 9% are transferring in from a cohort. So although at Southwestern from day one, when they're in their FYS, we're trying to talk to them about the importance of taking advantage of high-impact practices, for students who have transferred in, they may have less exposure to that. So again, just talking to them about how important these sorts of experiences are really can make a difference. And then last but not least, at least 10% of our student population comes from out of the state of Texas. Of those, about 33 different states are represented, as well as about 12 different countries. These students probably have considerably weaker social networks in Texas. So when they're looking for opportunities to take advantage of, it really might help to have access to your networks. They will know fewer people around, they will have fewer of those networks for themselves. And so it really becomes key to help them network with people that are in the area. So with that in mind, here are just some tips for engaging students. And this is true regardless of students' background, but particularly considering the things that we were just talking about. First, at all costs, I try to avoid terminology that my students may or may not understand. Some terms are so ingrained in the way that I talk that I assume everybody knows them. I study adult romantic relationships. That is my area of research. We call those dyadic relationships. That just flows from my tongue in everyday conversation. And sometimes people look at me and I'm like, oh, right. Interactions that involve two people, right? That is a term that is used in my field that's not necessarily known to everybody. And I think the same is probably true in every field. There will be certain types of terminology that are so common in the field that it's easy to assume that other people understand them, but just really recognizing what that terminology is and explaining those things become really important, because our students may not stop you to tell you they don't know what those things mean, right? They probably are trying to make a good impression. There's probably a lot of impression management going on there, and so they might just let it go unsaid and not really understand the point that's going on. Similarly, I tend to over-explain and then let my students stop me if they already know what I'm talking about. So I would rather break things down into more steps than is necessary. I'd rather go into more detail than is necessary. And I'll tell them, if you already know this, just stop me and we can move on to something else. But that makes it where, regardless of where we're starting, regardless of what they know coming into it, they'll have the information that they need. And they can stop you if they already know it and say, oh, I do understand that. We can move on to the next thing or whatever. But it keeps them from having to tell you they don't know or understand what you just said. Another thing that our students are really fortunate to have on campus is all sorts of resources available to them outside of this mentorship program. We are so thankful for you because you're complementing the work that is going on campus. But there are other places they can go to have access to some of this help. So for example, our career services, 6th in the nation. They are incredible at helping our students with interview skills, write resumes, find jobs, network with other alum. please, please, please refer them to use these spaces. We are doing that in the classroom. We're trying to get them to take advantage of these resources. But the more places that they hear that message, go, ask for help, the more likely they are to do it. So please refer them to resources they have access to here on campus. For all of my students, when I'm meeting with them, particularly for the first time, I try to find a point of similarity that we can connect on and bring that up in our conversation. So for example, when we have first year advisees, we get a little bit of information from their application about things like where they're from, things that they're interested in. And my understanding is you will have access to very similar information. As you're reviewing that, look for a point of commonality. One that is common for me, I graduated from Alexander High School in Laredo. And so if I see that a student is from Laredo or really anywhere in the Valley, I let them know that. And it's shocking to me how much that puts them at ease, knowing that we have that in common. I had students who bring that fact up 3 or 4 years later, right? I had them in their first year here, and then in their senior year, we're talking about holidays. I'm like, oh, are you going back to Laredo for the holidays? They really remember those sorts of things. And so I find making that type of a connection early on really makes a difference in the rapport I have with those students. My understanding of the program is you will have a set of questions that y'all are going through each time that you meet. And you have those questions ahead of time. The students have those questions ahead of time. And for my most introverted students, I find that sometimes just having those questions isn't enough, but they really need to start thinking about those ahead of time to gather some of their thoughts so they are ready to engage in those conversations. And the way that I do that is I have my students write. I don't grade my reflection activities, so for things like my advisees, if there's things I want them to think about, I have them send me an email. It's a paragraph. And I just tell them, in preparation for our meeting together, I would really love to know some of this information about you ahead of time. It'll help me better prepare. It doesn't need to be a formal paragraph or a formal essay, but if you would just send me a little bit about your answer to, and then I choose a question that I really want to focus on in our interactions. It does help me to know some of that information ahead of time, but really it helps them formulate their thoughts. And when they are really nervous or they're engaging in an interaction where they may be less sure of themselves, they can fall back on the things that they've already written to start that conversation. And I find it really helps them to start talking, to have thought through some of those things ahead of time. One of my big tips, this is particularly true in the classroom, but in any setting, is not to be afraid of silence. Sometimes I ask a question and students don't answer within the first few seconds, and it's really easy for me to jump in and want to start answering it for them. So I make myself count to 10. And if that's not enough, sometimes I make myself count to 20, right? And it is uncomfortable for the person moderating or feeling responsible for advancing that conversation for there to be that silence. It's more uncomfortable for the people answering those questions, but if you let it be silent for long enough, they will say something just to break that awkwardness. And then you can go from there and it gets them talking. So I find being comfortable with the silence, preparing myself for the awkwardness I might feel is worth it, because eventually they start talking. And once they start talking, they keep talking. They just have to get over that initial fear of saying some of these things. And then my last tip here, I only use conditionally because it's not my favorite of all of these, but when I am really stuck and just can't get a student to engage with me in some way, I answer the question first. So I give them an example from my own personal experience. I will say of all of these strategies, it's probably the most effective in getting them to talk. Once you offer an example, they're much more likely to then give their own. The reason it's my least favorite is once I've given them the example, they usually look for an example that's most similar to mine. So whatever example it is that I give there dictates how that conversation goes, and you lose your ability to customize it based on what they would have otherwise said. But when all else fails, I find it's a pretty good way to get them talking. So these are just some of the tips that I use when I'm interacting with students. No doubt you have several others that are wonderful and effective. These are just some things that came to my mind. But I hope that as you engage with our students, as you are helping them in such a wonderful and meaningful way, you find at least some of these productive in creating conversations that help move them in their journey as students here at Southwestern. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you have a really wonderful interaction with our students.